It's good to see you all this morning. I can now see you. And thank you for letting me interrupt your regular service. It's very good to be able to be present. It's a little warmer here than it is with you, though the weather has turned. And unfortunately, as you can probably hear, it's the season of colds. And those of you with children will know that one of the blessings they bring home from kindergarten on a regular basis are small illnesses. So both Fiona and I are battling colds at the moment, so apologies for my voice. As I mentioned previously, next week I will be in Dubai, and I'll be helping to facilitate our communion delegation's engagement with the local church and advocating our global message for a just transition away from our dependence on fossil fuels. That's going to be a huge change of scene for me. I've spent the last month helping to support the coordination of the Anglican response to the violence and destruction in Gaza, as Anglicans from around the world have been wanting to assist the Anglican Al Ahli Hospital in Gaza City. Fiona, as she mentioned, has been even busier providing surge supports to the Palestine shelter cluster. And that's a role she held previously before our CMS days. And they're currently still looking for someone to take that job on full time. She's not had a day off in a month, and I've been doing all of the housework and all of the childcare in the meantime, which has been exhausting for us both and very different to our normal pattern of life. The contrast between domestic life this week and international advocacy with the great, the good, and the not so good next feels stark. As Catherine mentioned, next week will also be the beginning of Advent, as we prepare ourselves for the coming of Emmanuel, God with us, in the tiny, vulnerable form of a child. But today we remember not the human baby, but Christ the King, seated on the throne of his glory, as we heard in the Gospel reading. At the Arabic church at which I worship here, we've been slowly working our way through the Gospel of Matthew, with the parable of the prepared and unprepared bridesmaids, and the parable of the talents in the same chapter over the past 2 weeks. These teachings of Jesus are taking place in the week between his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday and the awful rejection and handing him over to death on Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. So today is the feast of Christ the King, something I have to admit I was unaware of before we moved to Jerusalem 8 years ago, but it is hugely popular with Christians in the Middle East and Palestine in particular. My colleague Paolo, who does similar work with the Anglican Alliance but in Latin America, does not share their enthusiasm. He was raised on liberation theology and amongst military dictatorships. For him, elevating Jesus, the suffering servant, to a place enthroned and pictured crowned in medieval pomp is anathema. So why is it so popular in Palestine? To me, I think that it's inspired by the hope of what does not exist here on earth, of a truly just rule, where all are welcome, all are cherished, and peace reigns. This is in stark contrast to the political reality most of us face, where ideology constrains the generosity of the state at best, and at worst, codifies discrimination and the denial of rights. Such is the continued experience of Palestinians in Gaza, inside the West Bank and in Israel itself, through the failure of the peace process, the venality of their own politicians, and the intransigence of an Israeli political leadership that has made no deal the deal, continuing expansionist settlement policy. What makes this vision of Christ the King, of Jesus, look so different? One of the church fathers, Cyril of Alexandria, wrote that Christ's kingly nature is one defined by his dominion over all creatures, dominion not seized by violence or usurped, but by his essence. This differentiates and legitimizes Christ over so many of the rulers of the nations of this world, who fight, literally or politically, for their temporary positions of power. Jesus is here represented as eternal and imbued with this kingly status in his very nature. But that ancient patriarch Cyril had more to say. Christ is our king by acquired right too, as our redeemer through the cross, his death, and his resurrection, a liberator of all captive souls. So let us approach the text of Matthew's gospel that we heard a few minutes ago. The two previous parables found in chapter 25 are all about the imminent return or arrival of someone, For the bridesmaids, they await the arrival of a groom coming to inaugurate the wedding feast. Those whose oil has run out miss out on the celebration on account of their lack of preparation and at great cost. In the second, the stewards who grow the value of property with which they have been charged the caring of are rewarded. And the third, who simply buries it, is excluded from participating in that future abundance. Today's text shifts from the care of inanimate objects to the care of other people. Jesus refers to the coming of the Son of Man, an ancient epithet found in the book of Daniel and apparently used to describe himself as the Messiah. The parables of earlier are replaced by a prophetic vision where the king, in kingly judgeship, the Son of Man will separate people one from another. Here is a repetition of the judgment we can observe in the early stories, but the motivation of the judgment has changed. Jesus says in verses 34 to 36, "Come, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me." And this confuses those present, the righteous, of which ask when it was that they saw him hungry, when it was that they gave him food, or thirsty and gave him something to drink. The king, Jesus says, will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." The love we show for those around us is showing a love to Christ, perceiving the image and likeness of God in the other, not ignoring the average person for the sake of bestowing honor on a celebrity, but in recognizing the inalienable presence of Christ in all those we encounter. Jesus makes it clear that those who have been separated from the righteous have failed in this regard. They cannot see that they didn't care for the king because it was a king they were looking for, not loving those in need and seeing their kingly inheritance within. Jesus exemplifies these qualities in his earthly ministry. He heals those with the audacity to call on him for healing. The daughter of the Canaanite woman who claims inclusion in the redeeming work he is doing. He provides food. He hears and responds to the cries and delight of children. For me, the work of the Anglican Diocese of Jerusalem is daily doing this work, seeing Christ in the other and finding a way to provide the help that is needed. Many of you will have heard about the Al-Ahli Hospital in Gaza City, currently the only hospital in northern Gaza still accepting patients, albeit for first aid only, given the lack of surgical supplies they currently have. With the welcome arrival of the ceasefire, we've been hearing of the immediate return of people in need who have stayed away in recent days whilst Israeli tanks surrounded the hospital. The hospital was about to start cancer treatment, an absolute necessity where there are precious few chemotherapy options within the Gaza Strip, and less than 10% of medical requests for permission to leave Gaza for better care are approved. Similarly, the Princess Basma Center on the top of the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem works on rehabilitation and care for children with physical and mental challenges, but many of its patients are based in the West Bank and are similarly unable to access the center, currently with many ongoing checkpoint closures. So they have launched a program of telemedicine where doctors speak with patients' families and pharmacists in the West Bank to continue offering care. My own parish here in Jordan of St. Paul's, Ashrafia, is made up predominantly of refugees, displaced people and migrant workers from Iraq and Egypt. All are welcome and all are supported, regardless of their experience. Poverty is a need, regardless of political status here. Outside of that example, the majority of those the church supports in this diocese are Muslims, many without the capacity to pay for the services they need. Diocesan staff work hard to find the funds to keep these ministries going, especially when the tourist and pilgrim sector, a major source of income, has collapsed in light of the violence. To me, today it is essential for us to see the hungry, naked, imprisoned in those so often we consider other, not only our similar neighbour, but the ones that society despises. In the Middle East, these others are painfully visible. Religious minorities attacked by Daesh, continued oppression of the Armenians, the hatred shown to Syrian refugees in Lebanon. the oppression of Palestinians on their own land and where they have been displaced to. Christians persecuted through perceived association with the West, which continues to, in many people's views here, legitimize violence against Muslims in this region. 2023 has been a tough year in the Middle East. Who now remembers the earthquake in Turkey and Syria at its beginning? Or the earthquake in Morocco? Friends of ours woke to the deaths of many of their neighbors and destroyed homes in the Atlas Mountains that September morning. Or the flooding in Libya. And the displacement in Sudan is at a scale rarely seen, and the word genocide is openly being pondered there too. In February, I met the Anglican Archbishop of Sudan, Ezekiel Kundu. His home, his car, and the church compound in Khartoum are now all burned, and he is sheltering with many others in Port Sudan on the coast. The world is turning a blind eye. And further south, the civil war in Yemen, a proxy for Sunni and Shia powers in the region, rumbles on. As a family, we've been affected by all this deeply, and particularly with what is now going on in Palestine and Israel. We are distressed by the deaths of family members of our friends in Gaza. Khaled, the most beloved, only surviving son of Fiona's former colleague, Amal, was killed with over 10 other members of her family on the 17th of October. Friends in Jerusalem now feel unable to cross that invisible green line that separates west and east parts of the city, not wanting to be seen as the enemy on the wrong side of town. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim friends across Israel have been in and out of bomb shelters over the past month, but they have bomb shelters. Those in Gaza do not. We grieve the asymmetry of violence and oppression and power. My call to you is that we perceive Christ not as a distant king to remove, but in the eyes of every single person we meet, every person we see on TV, on our computers, and on our phones. Those we have so much compassion for, and those we struggle to love. In the Isaiah prophecy we'll read through Advent, we see Jesus as the Prince of Peace, under whose authority there shall be endless peace. On the separation wall dividing Palestinian Bethlehem from access to Jerusalem, there is a graffiti which proclaims Ephesians 2:14. For he is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. In Christ, there is reconciliation between peoples and between ourselves and God. But in the same way that we can perceive Christ in the other, it is us who must be God's hand and feet, in the body of Christ, working within the world for justice. God's kingdom is ushering in. In our second reading from Romans, we also heard Paul promote a clear vision for the implication of seeing Christ in all, in his marks of a Christian. They are profound and challenging words. Paul calls on the Roman Christians and on us today to let our love be genuine, to rejoice in hope, to be patient in suffering, and to persevere in prayer. What does it mean for us to bless those who persecute you, do not curse them, as we read in verse 14? Here, in the Middle East, it means being able to extend the hand of peace to those who are prosecuting a war of occupation, of engaging with an other that has killed members of your own family. And that goes on both sides. And it means risking one's own credibility within your own community in order to do so. In verse 15, Paul calls to rejoice with those who rejoice and to weep with those who weep. So today, in the midst of a ceasefire, that means to be genuinely overwhelmed in the joy that Israeli children and women are being returned to their families after more than a month in captivity. It also means rejoicing for the Thai and Filipino migrant workers who've been able to go back to their families after the same ordeal. But it also means being able to celebrate the return of Palestinian child prisoners to their families, the overwhelming number of whom had never been charged with a crime. Their own families have been banned of celebrating this joy on threat of rearrest if they do so when their family members return to their homes in the West Bank. Conversely, to weep with those who weep means remembering all those Israeli families who've yet to be reunited with their family. Weeping with those who cannot be reunited because their mothers and fathers, their brothers and sisters, their children have been murdered. It means weeping with the Palestinian families who have also had their children, their brothers and sisters, their fathers and mothers murdered with revenge-filled rockets. We continue to weep for the ongoing and insidious horror of the occupation. And for that, what that means for those living in fear in Israel itself and in Palestine. And we weep for this unwillingness to risk peace. This is what it is to live in harmony with one another, as stated in verse 16 of the passage of Romans. To go outside of one's comfort zone, outside of one's tribe, and to pursue justice and peace. Not repaying evil for evil, as we see in verse 17, is easier said than done. So how do we Christians build peace within our homes and our communities and across national stages? Especially for us here in Palestine and Jordan, when we can constitute only about 2% of the total population. Archbishop Hossam, the Anglican Archbishop in Jerusalem, has, to my mind, been a great example of this, continuing to call for peace with justice, denouncing violence, because violence itself can never be good. Even in the aftermath of the rocket strike, whoever's responsibility it was on Al-Ahli Hospital, his call was and remains for peace. Verse 19 of Romans 12 reminds us never to avenge ourselves. That's not our responsibility. Therefore, we must continue to recognize the horror of the terror that we saw on the 7th of October and not seek to minimize it or relativize it, but to condemn the physical violence of it, whilst continuing to reject the political violence that is also being carried out and has been carried out. But all this applies to you as much as it does to us in the Middle East. There can be a challenge in seeing what is possible. What can I do at such a remove? But you can, both here and at home. You've always been so generous to us as a family, and we are so grateful for your support. But do please consider supporting the Diocese of Jerusalem through organisations such as the Jerusalem and the Middle East Churches Association, Jamaica, based in England. They are continuing to support not only the work of Al-Ahli, but also other institutions of the diocese. Embrace the Middle East are supporting our work too, as well as meaningful peace-building efforts that will need more work than ever after the existential crisis of the possibility of peace being blown up in these past 6 weeks. But you also have the opportunity to affect change in your own homes. For me, it has been parenthood where I feel I can actively make a difference, showing love and affection to my children, even as my own capacity for patience feels compromised, and when they are sensing my own discombobulation. Gentle forms of masculinity feel more needed now than ever. In your communities, help to work to resist hatred and to denounce anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as evils that has nothing to do with helping the suffering of Palestinians or the suffering of Israelis, but deepens misunderstanding and hatred of Jewish, Arab, and Muslim communities. So through prayer and practice, work to be the one who responds to the need of the hungry, the poor, the naked, the prisoner, without falling into the trap of helping those who deserve help, but those with the audacity to ask. We worship Christ as King today, not because he seized power or inherited it, but by his own self-sacrificing nature and the redemption he has brought us all. We worship Christ as King as he is the Prince of Peace, the one who has brought reconciliation. We worship Christ as the servant king, who took off clothes and washed his disciples' feet, who was led away into suffering and death, and was crowned with thorns rather than the splendors of temporal rule promised him by Satan in the desert. Jesus upends our assumptions on kingly behavior, of what power looks like. As we continue to recognize Jesus in those around us, may our grasping for power rescind into the open palm of peace. May we worship Christ, who did not exploit equality with God, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave and being born in human likeness. As we approach Christmas, through the Advent that is ahead of us, may Jesus' radical love, leadership, and sacrifice inspire us towards weakness and humility and love for the other. Amen.